when nearly 400,000 German prisoners of war discovered America's untouched industrial colossus, they confronted an impossible truth that shattered every belief their nation had instilled in them, forcing them to reckon with the reality that their war was already lost. Between 1942 and 1945, over 400,000 German and Italian prisoners of war were held across more than 500 camps throughout rural America. Most were hardened African Corps veterans indoctrinated by Nazi propaganda to believe that America was a divided, starving nation incapable of sustained industrial production. They had been told that victory was inevitable, that American democracy was collapsing from within, that the homeland was untouchable. The moment these soldiers stepped onto American soil, everything they believed began to unravel. They encountered not a bombed-out wasteland, but a functioning continental paradise. Pullman railway cars instead of cattle cars. Abundant food despite the supposed blockade. Factories so vast and so productive that they defied comprehension. Workers living better than German aristocracy. Machines more sophisticated than German military equipment. A landscape entirely untouched by war, running at full industrial capacity. This is the story of Otto, a 22-year-old German prisoner of war, and the spiritual and intellectual collapse that came when the walls of certainty crashed down. It is the story of how propaganda meets reality, how belief systems fracture under the weight of evidence, and how a young man begins to understand that everything he has sacrificed for may have been built on lies. Through his eyes, and through the eyes of Tom, an American foreman, Evelyn, a factory machinist, Samuel, an African-American janitor whose own struggles illuminate the paradoxes of American ideals, and Klaus, a fellow prisoner who refuses to see, we witness the moment when a nation's mythology collides with material truth and the human cost of that collision. This is not a story about military victory. It is a story about the moment when a soldier realizes his entire world has been constructed from fiction. The Atlantic Ocean in the spring of 1943 had become a highway for defeat. Across its dark waters, transport ships carried the remnants of German military ambition, thousands of captured soldiers, many of them from North Africa, many still believing that this capture was temporary, that the war would turn, that Germany would prevail. Among them was Otto Brenner, 22 years old. Born in the Rhineland in 1921, his father had been a railroad worker. His mother had died when Otto was 8. He had been conscripted in 1940, trained for 8 months, and shipped to North Africa in early 1942. For nearly 2 years, he had fought across 2 continents. He had seen death in forms that would never leave his memory. He had been captured in Tunisia in March of 1943, during the final collapse of the Africa Corps. For weeks, he had been held in temporary camps, fed on reduced rations, uncertain of his fate. And then, after weeks of waiting, he had been loaded onto a transport ship heading west, heading toward America. Like all the other prisoners, Otto had been told his entire life what to expect from America. The propaganda was consistent, detailed, repeated until it became, for most German soldiers, not propaganda, but fact. America was a nation in decline. Its cities had been rendered to rubble by German bombing campaigns, though this was largely fantasy.
Its people were starving under the effects of the blockade. Its class system was collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. Its racial divisions were so severe that civil war seemed imminent. American workers, soft and comfort-seeking, lacked the discipline and ideological commitment of German workers. American industry was antiquated. American soldiers were poorly trained and poorly motivated. In short, America was weak. And weakness in the calculus of Nazi ideology meant that victory was inevitable. The Third Reich simply needed to hold on, to endure, to maintain its will and its unity. Then, inevitably, the decadent nations of the West would crumble, and German civilization would emerge supreme. Otto had believed this. He had been taught this. He had fought in part because he believed this. Now, as the transport ship approached the American coast, Otto stood with hundreds of other prisoners below deck in the darkness, listening to the rhythm of the engines, feeling the rise and fall of the hold, waiting for whatever came next. The air was thick and recycled. Men coughed. Men spoke in low German voices. Men tried to sleep, their minds churning with fear and uncertainty. When the hatches finally opened and daylight poured into the hold, the first shock came. Not from the landscape, from the harbor, from the sheer scale and functioning condition of American industrial infrastructure. There were cranes, dozens of them, functioning, loading and unloading cargo with mechanical precision. There were warehouses stretching along the docks, their roofs intact, their structures undamaged. There was machinery, trucks, forklifts, equipment that Otto recognized as modern, efficient, purposeful. There were ships, dozens of ships, being loaded with cargo, functioning, operating. Otto climbed out of the hold with his fellow prisoners, squinting in the bright light, and looked at the harbor. What he was seeing contradicted something fundamental in his understanding of the world. If America had been bombed to devastation, as he had been told, then where was the devastation? Where were the ruins, the rubble, the signs of a nation reduced to bare survival? The prisoners were marched down the gangway in columns. The guards flanked them, but there was no brutality, no unnecessary force, just efficiency, professional competence, respectful, factual. The prisoners were being processed like cargo being delivered to a warehouse, firmly, but not cruelly. And then they saw the trains. Not cattle cars, Pullman cars, railway coaches designed for civilian passengers, heated, with windows, with seats. A man near Otto, Klaus, who would become his tent mate and his conscience and his challenge, leaned close and whispered in German, "Do not react, do not show emotion. This is psychological warfare. They want us to believe we will be treated well. It is a lie." But Otto was already beginning to suspect that Klaus might be wrong, because what he was seeing, the functioning harbor, the intact infrastructure, the orderly professionalism of the American guards, the comfortable rail cars, suggested something that had never been mentioned in the propaganda. That perhaps America was not what he had been told. Perhaps America was exactly what it appeared to be: strong, functioning, undamaged, abundant. The warning of that thought was too large to fully form, so he did not form them. Not yet. Instead, he boarded the train, took a seat, and watched the landscape roll past as they traveled inland. For 2 days, the train moved through America, through small towns without bomb damage, through farmland with equipment that seemed impossibly sophisticated, through landscapes that seemed to contradict everything Otto believed about the state of American civilization. The towns had functional power lines, intact buildings, shops that appeared to be operating, automobiles on the roads, not commandeered for military use, but in private hands, driven by civilians. Klaus maintained his skepticism, muttering that this was propaganda, that devastation was hidden, that America's collapse was real but concealed. But Otto was beginning to understand something that Klaus could not permit himself to consider. What if this was not propaganda? What if this was simply the truth? And if it was the truth, what did that mean about everything else? The train finally came to rest at a POW facility in the American South. The processing began. The paperwork, the photographs, the assignments to specific camps. And as Otto was processed, as he was cataloged and recorded, he began to understand that he was entering into a new kind of captivity. Not brutal, not dehumanizing, but captivity nonetheless.
Camp Forest, Tennessee, in the summer of 1943, existed in a landscape of low hills and red clay. It was a sprawling facility, barracks arranged in precise rows, administrative buildings, mess halls, a hospital, recreation areas, all organized according to military principle. But it was not a place of cruelty. It was not a concentration camp. It was a prisoner of war camp, administered according to the Geneva Convention, a document that the Nazi regime had in many ways rendered meaningless through its own practices, but which the Americans, it seemed, took seriously. The first revelation was the sheer orderliness of it. Everything had a place. Everything functioned according to rules that were written down and posted and enforced with consistency. The guards did not abuse the prisoners. They did not starve them. They did not make random acts of cruelty the punishment for minor infractions. Instead, the camp was run with a kind of distant professionalism. Prisoners were fed according to regulation. They were allowed to move within the compound without being beaten. They were not subjected to ideological instruction or coercion. They were simply managed. This was not what Otto expected from American military administration. He had been told that American democracy was chaos, that it was inefficient, that it was the result of a system collapsing under its own internal contradictions. But what he encountered at Camp Forest was organization, system, clear rules applied consistently to all people regardless of rank or political belief. Within days of arrival, Otto was assigned to a work detail. His assignment was the textile mill near Jackson, Michigan. He would be part of a rotating detail, shipped out each day from the camp, transported to the mill, worked for 8 hours, transported back. He would be paid in script, camp currency, which he could use to purchase small items from the camp canteen, tobacco, writing materials, canned fruit. The payment itself was remarkable. Prisoners were being paid for their work? This was not a concept that existed in Nazi Germany. German soldiers were not paid for military labor, they were conscripted. To receive payment for work, even as a prisoner, was a principle so foreign to Otto's experience that it took him time to fully understand it. On his first day at the mill, Otto encountered Tom. Tom was the foreman of the loading dock detail. He was a lean man in his early 50s with weathered skin, calloused hands, and the bearing of someone who had worked in mills his entire life. He wore a short-sleeved shirt despite the summer heat, and his arms were marked by years of work in hot environments.
Dom conducted a brief orientation. He spoke in simple, direct English. He explained what the prisoners would be doing. He explained the safety rules. He explained what would happen if equipment was damaged. He explained that if the prisoners worked hard and caused no trouble, they would be treated fairly and fed well. It was not a speech. It was information, delivered professionally, expected to be understood and followed. What struck Otto was the assumption embedded in Tom's words that prisoners could understand rational explanations, that they could be trusted to follow rules if those rules were explained clearly, that they were, in short, human beings capable of understanding cause and effect, capable of self-interest and reasonable behavior. This was not the view of prisoners that Otto had been taught. He had been told that prisoners should be broken, dehumanized, made dependent, kept uncertain and afraid. Instead, Tom was treating them as workers, as men, as people who would respond to clear expectations and fair treatment. The textile mill itself was another shock. It was a functioning American industrial facility, producing cloth for military uniforms and equipment. The machinery was modern. The organization was efficient. The American workers, some of them men over military age, some of them women, some of them, Otto noticed with surprise, African American workers, moved through the space with practiced efficiency, each person performing their task, each task connected to the larger whole. The scale was different from what Otto had imagined. The mill was large, but not impossibly so. What struck him was not the size, but the precision. Everything moved according to a schedule. Nothing was wasted. The flow of materials through the facility was choreographed, as if someone had thought deeply about how to organize the work for maximum efficiency. Friedrich, a prisoner from Bavaria who had become Otto's friend, began working on the same detail. Friedrich had spent 3 years in North Africa before his capture. He was older than Otto, perhaps 30, and had the bearing of a professional soldier. After the first day of work, as they were being transported back to camp in the back of a truck, Friedrich said something to Otto in German. The American system is different from what we believed. Klaus responded sharply, insisting that the Americans were more sophisticated in their deceptions, that they'd treated prisoners well only to make them compliant, to weaken their loyalty, to make them forget the struggle. But Otto could see that even Klaus was struggling. The evidence was too overwhelming. The treatment was too fair. The organization was too competent. The factories were too productive. The landscape was too untouched. Every piece of propaganda about American weakness was contradicted by direct observation. That evening in the barracks at Camp Forest, as the prisoners lay on their bunks in the darkness, Otto thought about what he had seen. The mill, the American workers, the organization, the machinery. And he thought about his home in the Rhineland. He thought about his childhood. He thought about what he had been taught. And for the first time, a thought came to him that he could not suppress. What if we have been lied to? What if the war is not what we believe it to be? The thought was dangerous. In a military camp, even a prisoner camp, doubt was contagious. Klaus would sense it. Others would sense it. They would be pressured to conform to the approved narrative. But the thought had been planted, and it would grow.
3 weeks into his imprisonment, Otto was transferred. not as punishment, but as a part of a systematic rotation of prisoner labor throughout the American heartland. Work details were distributed based on labor needs, industrial demand, and military assessment of which prisoners were reliable and compliant. Otto, having caused no trouble and worked steadily, was considered suitable for a transfer to a more substantial industrial operation. The transfer took him north, away from Tennessee's hills, toward the industrial heartland of Michigan. As the train traveled, the landscape began to change. Small towns gave way to areas of denser development, and then, on the horizon, Otto saw something that made Klaus, sitting next to him, draw in a sharp breath. Smokestacks. Dozens of them, rising into the sky. Not in a cluster, but spread across a horizon that extended for miles. Smoke rising from industrial processes occurring continuously. Even in daylight, lights were burning inside the facilities because the work never stopped. The factories operated day and night, production running continuously, shift after shift, week after week. Otto had seen German factories. His father had taken him once, when Otto was a boy, to observe a precision tool factory in Cologne. It had seemed enormous to him then, modern. The sound of it was overwhelming. Machinery, shouting, the roar of industrial production. His father had pointed out the sophistication of the work, the organization of the labor, the German commitment to precision and quality. What Otto saw now made that factory look like a workshop. It was not a matter of degree. It was a matter of kind. The scale was fundamentally different. The number of smokestacks suggested multiple massive facilities. The continuous operation suggested a level of industrial capacity that Otto had not conceived was possible. Klaus leaned close and said in German, "It is not possible. There must be deception, some optical illusion." But Otto knew at that moment that Klaus was experiencing something that he could no longer deny. The visual evidence that everything he had been told was wrong. The facility itself was an automobile manufacturing plant converted to military production. Before the war, it had produced civilian automobiles. Now it produced trucks, military vehicles, jeeps, equipment for the American war effort. The facility was enormous. The parking lot covered acres, the building itself stretched for what seemed like several football fields. Otto was assigned to an assembly line. Not the most specialized work. He was not trained as a precision machinist. He was assigned to welding, to fastening components, to the basic labor that kept the line moving. The line itself represented a kind of brilliance in organization that Otto's mind struggled to fully comprehend. Each man had a single task. One man positioned the metal frame, the next man welded it, the next man attached a component, the next man fastened a bolt, the next man moved the item forward. 20 men worked in perfect synchronization, each man performing his task, each man's work enabling the next man's work. And the line moved continuously. Every 20 seconds, a new frame arrived at the first position. Every 20 seconds, a completed assembly moved to the next section. At that rate, Otto calculated, the line would produce between 15 and 20 completed vehicles per day, perhaps more. The organization was so perfect, the timing so precise,
that there was almost no wasted motion, no wasted time. The American foreman on this line was different from Tom. His name was Jack Donnelly. He was younger, perhaps 40, with intelligent eyes and the bearing of a man who had risen through technical expertise and proven competence. He moved along the line with a clipboard, checking measurements, making adjustments, ensuring that the process remained optimized. When Otto's welding showed imperfections, when the bead was not smooth enough or the heat was not applied correctly, he stopped him and demonstrated the correct technique. "You're creating too much heat here," he said, pointing to Otto's weld. "You want the bead to be smooth, not lumpy. Smooth bead, clean joint, stronger structure." Jack took the welding torch and demonstrated the technique. It was elegant, simple, obviously correct. Do it right, and you'll do fine. Do it wrong, and the vehicle might not hold up when it's needed, so do it right. What struck Otto was something subtle, but fundamental. Jack was not treating the work as something to be endured. He was treating it as a problem to be solved. He was interested in the quality of the output. He was interested in optimization. He was thinking. In the German engineering education that Otto had received, the emphasis on precision, on craftsmanship, on individual mastery of a skill suddenly seemed quaint compared to this. American engineering was not about individual brilliance. It was about system. It was about taking workers of varying skills and organizing their labor so efficiently that the output was both consistent and rapid. The lunch break was 30 minutes. Otto and Friedrich sat together, eating American food provided by the plant. Sandwiches, fruit, milk, cookies. Much more generous than the camp rations. Around them, American workers of different ages and backgrounds were doing the same. Some were reading, some were smoking, some were sleeping, some were examining blueprints and discussing technical problems. Some were simply sitting, recovering energy.
Friedrich turned to Otto and said something that Otto had begun to think, but had not yet voiced. The American workers are thinking. They are not just executing commands. They are thinking about the work, about how to do it better. We were told this was not possible in a capitalist system, that workers were simply exploited, broken creatures without agency or intelligence. But look at them. They are thinking. Otto could see it too. The American workers seemed to have a different relationship to their labor. They were not slaves to the line. They were participants in a process that they appeared to understand and, in many cases, to care about. The quality of the work mattered to them, not because they would be punished if it was poor, but because, and this was the revelation, they seemed to take pride in doing work well. This was not a concept that Otto had been trained to recognize in American capitalism. He had been told that American workers were alienated, broken, dehumanized by capital, that the capitalist system was destroying human dignity and human connection. And yet, what he saw contradicted that narrative so completely that he began to understand something crucial. The propaganda had not merely exaggerated American weakness, it had inverted American reality. A young American worker, perhaps 23 or 24, with intelligent eyes and a confident bearing, sat down next to Otto and Friedrich. His name tag read Dennis. "You fellows speak English?" Dennis asked. Friedrich nodded. "Some, I am speaking English."
Where are you from? Germany, right? Yes, I am from Bavaria. Dennis smiled. My grandmother's from Bavaria, or was. She came to America in 1921. Married my grandfather in Detroit. They have a farm now, north of here. She still makes sauerkraut the old way. I've eaten it at family dinners my whole life. Friedrich and Otto exchanged glances. This was not the interaction they had been prepared for. This was a young American treating them not as enemies, not as members of a hostile nation, but as human beings, as people connected to places and families and traditions. That is very kind for you to speak to us, Friedrich said. Dennis shrugged. Why wouldn't I? War's a terrible thing. You guys didn't want to be here any more than I wanted to be fighting. You're just trying to survive, same as anyone else. Klaus, who had overheard the exchange from a distance, moved past Otto afterward and muttered something in German about fraternization and weakness and the spiritual corruption of contact with the enemy. But Klaus's voice had lost some of its authority. The evidence was overwhelming now. The factories, the scale, the organization, the abundant food, the professional treatment, the kindness of individual Americans, it was all too much. It contradicted too thoroughly everything that Klaus and all of them had been taught. That afternoon, Otto returned to his position on the assembly line. He performed his welding. He watched the vehicles take shape. He understood with a clarity that was almost painful that what he was witnessing was the industrial apparatus that would ultimately defeat Germany, not through military genius, not through ideological superiority, but simply through the brute force of industrial capacity, through organization, through the dedication of millions of workers, American workers, paid workers, relatively well-treated workers, to the production of the materials of war. The war, Otto began to understand, was not a battle of wills or ideologies. It was an engineering problem, and America had solved the engineering problem better than Germany had.
There was a moment, precisely locatable in time and space, when Otto's world began to rupture. It was not a moment of revelation, not a single event that suddenly clarified everything. It was instead a series of small moments, accumulated over days and weeks, that together created a kind of irresistible pressure on the framework of belief that he had inherited. The first of these moments came on a late August afternoon, when Otto cut his hand on a sharp edge of metal while working on the assembly line. It was not a serious injury, perhaps an inch-long laceration on the palm of his left hand. It bled, but not excessively. Otto continued working, wrapping a cloth around the wound, assuming that he would simply endure it until the end of his shift. But Jack Donnelly noticed. He stopped the line, stopped the entire assembly line, and escorted Otto to the plant's medical station. The medical station was run by an American nurse, a woman perhaps in her 40s, with kind eyes and professional competence. She cleaned the wound, she applied antiseptic, she wrapped it properly, she gave Otto a clean cloth to replace the blood-soaked one, and she sent him back to work. The stoppage of the line, even for a few minutes, would have been unthinkable in Otto's experience of German industry. In German factories, injury was often treated as the worker's personal misfortune. The line continued, the production continued. A wounded worker either kept up or fell behind. If he fell behind, he was removed and replaced. The production was more important than any individual's injury. But here, in this American facility, the line had stopped for Otto's injury. An American manager had prioritized the health of a prisoner of war over the continuation of production, even if it was only for a few minutes, even if it cost the facility some small number of vehicles in that day's production. When Otto returned to the line, Friedrich was waiting for him, and Otto could see in Friedrich's face that he had noticed the same thing. Something in the American approach to work, to labor, to human beings was different from what they had been taught. Days later, there was another moment. Otto was working overtime in extra shift, and he had not eaten dinner. His stomach was empty, his energy was flagging as the shift approached its end. Jack Donnelly noticed Otto's declining performance. He left the line again and returned with a sandwich wrapped in paper and a bottle of cold milk. He handed them to Otto without comment and returned to his work. Otto ate the sandwich, he drank the milk, and he understood, with a clarity that he could not deny, that an American had fed him, not because it was required, not because it was part of some strategic manipulation, but because he was hungry and an American had noticed and had chosen to do something about it. These moments accumulated. A guard at the camp, a young American soldier named Robert, began to speak with Otto in careful German that he was learning. Robert had visited Germany before the war as a child, when his parents had taken him to see relatives in Stuttgart. He spoke about the beauty of the landscape, the kindness of his relatives. He asked Otto if he was near Stuttgart. When Otto said he was from the Rhineland, Robert asked specific questions about the region, about towns he had visited, about landscapes he remembered. Robert was not pretending to be Otto's friend, but he was treating Otto as a human being, as a person with a history and a place of origin that meant meaning and beauty, not as a member of a hostile nation, not as an abstraction, as a man. There came an evening when Otto was returning to the camp, sitting in the back of a truck with Friedrich and several other prisoners. A convoy of American military vehicles passed them on the road. The vehicles were new, well-maintained, filled with supplies and equipment. As the convoy passed, Otto could see into the backs of the trucks, and what he saw was astonishing. American soldiers, young men like Otto, eating lunch while traveling. They had thermoses of hot coffee, they had sandwiches, they had cigarettes.
The contrast was stark. Otto had been a soldier for 3 years. He had never been fed like this as a soldier. He had known hunger that ached in his belly. He had known thirst that made his lips crack. He had known exhaustion so profound that he had fallen asleep while walking. But American soldiers, and these were not elite troops, but ordinary servicemen, were being cared for in ways that Otto had never imagined. And the implication of that observation was unavoidable. If this was how the Americans treated their own soldiers, if this was the standard of care and supply available to ordinary American military personnel, then the industrial base that was producing this abundance must be vast, beyond Otto's previous conception. Claus tried throughout this period to maintain the framework of ideological skepticism. He insisted that the kindness was strategic, that the Americans were trying to break the prisoner's will, that any German who was swayed by American kindness was succumbing to psychological warfare. He made his arguments to groups of prisoners at night in the barracks, and some listened. Some still wanted to believe that the Nazi narrative was true, that victory was possible, that Germany was merely enduring a difficult period that would eventually be overcome. But Klaus's arguments were becoming increasingly hollow. Too many prisoners had seen the factories. Too many had been treated with kindness. Too many had been fed well. Too many had encountered Americans who seemed not evil, not inferior, but simply human. The cognitive dissonance was becoming unbearable for some men. For others, the acceptance of a new reality was happening almost unconsciously, a gradual recalibration of understanding rather than a sudden rupture. Otto found himself in a state of profound moral confusion. He had sworn an oath. He had fought for his nation. He had believed in what he was fighting for. And now, in the space of a few months, the ground beneath all of that belief had become uncertain, unstable. He still wore the Wehrmacht uniform. The guards required it. He still spoke German with the other prisoners. He still had a place in the German prisoner community in the camp. But something fundamental had shifted. His loyalty was no longer monolithic. It had become fractured, partial, contingent. There was Samuel. Samuel was an African-American janitor who worked in various sections of the plant and the camp. He was perhaps 60 years old, with gray hair and dark eyes that seemed to contain their own stories of difficulty and persistence. Samuel was often present when Otto and the other prisoners were working, and sometimes he would speak with them. One afternoon, Samuel found Otto alone, sweeping near a storage area. Samuel sat down on a bench, apparently taking a break from his own work. "You're learning English pretty well," Samuel said to Otto. "Been watching you work. You listen careful. You try to understand." Otto, startled by the direct address, responded carefully. "I am trying to understand the work, the language." "Where are you from?" "The Rhineland, a place called, it is difficult to say in English, a small town. Not important." Samuel nodded. "My people came from the South. My grandfather was enslaved. He was freed after the war, the Civil War, long time ago. After that, my family worked for themselves, sharecropping. Then we came north to find work, to find freedom. I've been working in factories for 30 years. Otto did not fully understand all of the words, but the emotional content was clear. Samuel was speaking about a history of difficulty, of oppression, of searching for freedom. "America is not perfect, far from perfect. I face prejudice every day. Every day. I work alongside white men who would not sit at a table with me in most restaurants in this country. But we work together. And that's something. That's progress. That's real." Otto did not know how to respond. He understood that Samuel was telling him something important, something about the complexity of American society, the reality of it, not the propaganda version, but the actual lived experience of an American person. "You seem like a thoughtful young man. Don't close your mind to what you're seeing here. The fact that America is not perfect doesn't mean it's not strong. It doesn't mean your country is going to win. Don't waste your life believing in something that's already lost." Samuel stood and returned to his work, leaving Otto sitting with his thoughts, trying to process what he had heard, trying to understand what it all meant.
By October 1943, Otto had been working at the Jackson facility for almost 2 months. In that time, he had learned his tasks well. His welding had improved significantly. Jack Donnelly had even, on one occasion, remarked that Otto's work was solid. It was a small compliment, but it had meant something to Otto. Recognition of competence, recognition of effort, recognition of his individual contribution to the work. But increasingly,
Otto's thoughts were not focused on the immediate work. They were focused on something larger, something that had begun to form in his mind as an almost unbearable clarity. He was beginning to understand in concrete and undeniable terms the magnitude of American industrial capacity. The assembly line on which he worked produced approximately 12 vehicles per day per line. There were 4 lines in the Jackson facility. That meant 48 vehicles per day at this single location. The facility ran 6 days a week with reduced production on Sundays. That meant approximately 240 vehicles per week from this one plant. Nearly 12,000 vehicles per year from this single location. But Jackson was not the only facility. Otto had learned from conversations with other prisoners, from overheard discussions among American workers, from the gossip that moved through the prisoner community at the camp, that there were dozens of similar facilities across America. Dozens, all producing vehicles, all producing equipment, all running continuously. And this was only one category of production. There were other facilities producing aircraft, other facilities producing ammunition, other facilities producing every conceivable type of military equipment, steel mills, chemical plants, oil refineries, copper mines. Every element of modern warfare was being produced at scales that Otto's mind struggled to accommodate. One afternoon, while waiting for a truck to transport him and other prisoners back to camp, Otto found himself in conversation with an American guard named James. James was a career military man, perhaps 50 years old, with the bearing of someone who had been in the army for decades. James had been kind to the prisoners, professional, fair, but without the warmth that some of the younger guards showed. However, on this particular afternoon, James seemed willing to talk. Otto asked James a question in careful English. How many factories like Jackson making vehicles? James considered the question for a moment, and then he said, I'm not supposed to tell you this, but I reckon you'll see it soon enough anyway. There's more than 20 major facilities like this one. That's just vehicles. Then you've got airplane plants, ammunition plants, shipyards building ships faster than you can sink them, refineries, steel mills, all of it running at full capacity, all of it supplied with raw materials from this continent. No bombing to worry about, no supply lines being cut, all of it just running. James paused, and then he said something else. Your people lost this war the moment America entered it. Everyone who understands production knows that. It was just a matter of time. And at this point, it's just a matter of how many people have to die before your government accepts the inevitable. Otto did not respond. He did not know how to respond. But what James had said confirmed what Otto's own observations and calculations had been leading him toward. Germany could not win. Not anymore. Not ever, perhaps. From the moment America entered the war, the industrial capacity of America so vastly exceeded that of Germany that no strategy, no amount of courage, no depth of ideological commitment could overcome the fundamental imbalance. It was an understanding that approached something like despair. Otto had fought for 3 years. He had seen men die. He had been hungry. He had been afraid. And all of it had been in service to a cause that was mathematically, scientifically, absolutely doomed. That evening at the camp, Otto tried to explain this understanding to Friedrich. He drew diagrams in the dirt behind the barracks, showing the production rates he had calculated, showing the number of facilities, showing the mathematical impossibility of German victory. Friedrich listened carefully, and when Otto finished, Friedrich said something that Otto would remember for the rest of his life. I know. I have known for a year now. Perhaps longer. But knowing and accepting are different things. If I accept it, then I must ask myself why I have sacrificed what I have sacrificed. Why my friends have died. Why I fought if not for victory. If I accept that we have lost, then I must also accept that I have been wrong. That the cause I fought for was wrong.
Klaus, overhearing this conversation, became angry. He walked over and said something harsh to Friedrich, accusing him of defeatism and cowardice. Klaus insisted that the war was not lost, that Germany still had resources, that the American industrial capacity, while great, was not infinite, that if Germany could simply hold on, could simply endure, eventually the Americans would tire. Eventually, the will to continue would waver. But even as Klaus said these things, Otto could see the doubt in his eyes. Klaus was also a soldier. Klaus was also intelligent. Klaus could do mathematics. Klaus could understand production rates. Klaus knew, as certainly as Otto knew, that what James had said was true, that the war was already lost, that it had been lost perhaps from the moment the first American factory had begun to operate at full capacity. The realization created a strange kind of clarity. Otto found himself thinking about the war differently. He found himself thinking about the future differently. If Germany was going to lose, if defeat was inevitable, then the only question that remained was what would happen next. What would become of Germany? What would become of German people? What kind of reckoning would there be? And as Otto thought about these questions, he found his thoughts turning toward the kindness he had experienced, the fair treatment, the adequate food, the professional respect shown to him as a worker, the recognition of his humanity by Jack Donnelly, by Dennis, by Samuel, by James, by the American nurse who had bandaged his hand. If defeat was inevitable, then how the Americans treated Germans, both prisoners of war and eventually civilians, would matter. It would matter for how quickly the wound of defeat might heal. It would matter for whether Germany might rebuild or whether it might be destroyed completely. It would matter for whether German people might find a way to rejoin the community of civilized nations or whether they might be cast out entirely. In a strange way, the very evidence that had demonstrated German military defeat also demonstrated something else, that Americans were not the subhuman creatures of propaganda, that they were capable of humanity, that they were capable of treating enemies with fairness, that they were capable of rebuilding, that they were capable of making space for defeated nations within a larger international order. And Otto found himself hoping, quietly, carefully, almost secretly, that if German defeat came, it might come at the hands of such people. It might come from people who had shown him, directly and indirectly, that there was another way to be, another way to organize society, another way to treat prisoners, another way to conduct industrial production, another way to be human.
By late autumn of 1943, Otto had been a prisoner of war for nearly 9 months. In that time, he had crossed an invisible but absolute threshold. He could not return to the state of mind he had occupied before his capture. The propaganda that had seemed unquestionable now seemed obviously false. The picture of America that he had been given now seemed not merely inaccurate, but deliberately inverted. And yet, he could not fully let go of his German identity. He could not simply become someone else. He was still a German. He still had a family in the Rhineland, his father, whom he had not heard from in many months. He still spoke German. He still lived in a community of German prisoners. He still, in some essential way, was part of a nation and a culture that stretched back centuries. The conflict this created was almost unbearable at times. Otto found himself in a state of profound spiritual homelessness. He did not believe in the Nazi project anymore. He could not. The evidence was too overwhelming. The industrial capacity of America demonstrated that the Nazi understanding of history, of race, of inevitability was fundamentally wrong. But he also could not embrace America as his new home. He was not American. He did not fully understand American culture. He was a prisoner, a member of the defeated nation, an outsider. He found himself thinking during his work shifts and in the quiet moments before sleep in the barracks about the meaning of loyalty. What did it mean to be loyal to a nation that had lied to you? What did it mean to continue to wear the uniform of a nation that had been built on lies? What did it mean to maintain solidarity with men, like Klaus, who were actively trying to prevent other Germans from facing the truth? Klaus had begun to organize more actively among the prisoner population. He had identified a small group of committed National Socialists, men who still believed in the ideology, or who believed that maintaining ideological unity was necessary to prevent complete psychological collapse. Klaus was using social pressure, mockery, and occasional intimidation to discourage other prisoners from fraternizing too openly with American workers or from expressing doubts about German victory. Otto found himself increasingly at odds with Klaus. Friedrich was also beginning to move away from the Nazi framework, though more slowly and with more reluctance than Otto. One evening, Klaus confronted Otto directly in the barracks. Klaus spoke in German, his voice low but intense. "You are becoming an American sympathizer. You are losing your German identity. You are betraying the men who fought and died for the cause. If you continue down this path, you will lose your honor. You will become a traitor to your own people." Otto was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something that surprised even himself. "The pause was already a betrayal. We were lied to. I was lied to. We all were. And continuing to believe the lie does not honor the men who died. It wastes their sacrifice. It makes their death meaningless."
Klaus stared at Otto for a long moment, and then Klaus turned away. There was nothing more to be said between them. They were no longer speaking the same language, despite both speaking German. The realization of defeat, once accepted, created a strange kind of freedom. Otto found that he could work without the constant internal conflict of believing in inevitable victory while observing inevitable defeat. He could simply work. He could simply be. He could observe what was happening around him without the filter of propaganda. But this freedom brought its own forms of pain. Otto found himself thinking about his father with an intensity that sometimes made it difficult to continue working. His father had believed in the German project. He had been a good man, hardworking, honest, devoted to his family, but he had also believed what he had been told by his government. He had probably encouraged Otto's service. He had probably believed that Otto was fighting for something noble and true. What would his father think if he could see Otto now? If he, his father, could understand that everything they had both believed had been founded on deliberate falsehood. Otto did not know the answer to that question, and he found that not knowing was almost more painful than any definite answer would have been. Samuel, the African-American janitor, seemed to understand something of Otto's internal struggle. Samuel was present in many spaces where Otto worked, and occasionally he would find Otto alone and speak with him. Samuel's words were often simple, but they carried a weight that Otto was beginning to understand. One afternoon, Samuel said to Otto, "You're learning something hard, something about how the world actually works, not how you've been told it works. That's painful, but it's also a gift. Most people never learn it. They live their whole lives believing what they've been told. You're getting a chance to see the truth. Don't waste it." Otto asked Samuel a question. "What will happen to Germany after we lose?" Samuel considered the question carefully. "That depends on what kind of people are in charge of the winning side and on what the German people do. If the Americans are kind, if they want to build rather than destroy, Germany might recover, might become part of something new. Or if they want revenge, well, revenge is a powerful thing. It can destroy whole nations. I've seen it in this country. Seen what happens when people want revenge instead of justice. Seen the damage it does." Otto did not fully understand all of Samuel's meaning, but he understood the essential point. The future was not determined. It depended on choices, on how victory was used, on whether the winning nation would be merciful or cruel. And this brought Otto back to his observations about America, the kindness he had experienced, the professional treatment, the respect for the Geneva Convention, the fact that he was being fed adequately, treated fairly, allowed to work and to maintain his dignity. All of this suggested that America, or at least the Americans he was encountering, might be the kind of people Samuel was describing, might be capable of victory without revenge, might be capable of building something new rather than simply destroying what existed. But Otto could not be certain of this. This was hope, and Otto had learned through painful experience that hope was often betrayed. Still, he found himself hoping anyway. There was a moment in December 1943 when Otto received a letter from his father. It had taken nearly a year to reach him, routed through the Red Cross, delayed by the war itself. The letter was written in his father's careful hand. His father wrote about conditions in the Rhineland, about the increased bombing raids on German cities, about the fear that was beginning to grip the civilian population. His father did not write about the war directly, did not discuss strategy or military matters, but between the lines, Otto could read his father's own growing recognition that the situation was deteriorating. And then near the end of the letter, his father wrote something that Otto would remember for the rest of his life. "I have been thinking about the things I taught you, the things I believed. I am not certain anymore that I believed rightly. I hope wherever you are, that you are safe. I hope that you are learning to think for yourself. And I hope that when you return, if you return, you'll be able to help me understand where I have gone wrong." Otto read the letter 3 times. He sat with it for hours and he wept. He wept for his father, who was also beginning to understand. He wept for the lies they had both believed. He wept for the sacrifice that had been made in service to those lies. He wept for the time that could never be recovered. And he wept for the fragile hope that somehow, if he survived, if his father survived, they might be able to rebuild something true together.
Winter came to Michigan, and the landscape was transformed by snow. The barracks became colder. The work at the factory continued without interruption. Otto had now been imprisoned for nearly a year. He had been working at the Jackson facility for more than 6 months. In that time, something quiet but profound had shifted within him. He no longer experienced the sense of outrage or betrayal that had characterized his first months of captivity. He no longer felt the constant tension of cognitive dissonance. He had, in a way that was not quite conscious, accepted his circumstances. He was a prisoner of war in America. That was his reality. The question was no longer whether this was just or fair. It was not. The question was how to live within this reality with dignity and with some degree of peace. He found that he could take quiet satisfaction in the quality of his work. Jack Donnelly had begun to assign him to training other prisoners, particularly those who were newly arrived and had no experience with welding or precision assembly work. Otto found himself teaching the correct technique to these men, and in doing so, he experienced something that he had not anticipated: the satisfaction of transmitting knowledge, of helping someone else succeed at a task, of contributing not just to production, but to the competence and dignity of his fellow prisoners. Friedrich had experienced a similar transformation. Friedrich had been assigned to work in the mill's maintenance section, repairing and maintaining the machinery. Friedrich had always been skilled with machines, and in this role, he had found a kind of purpose. He was no longer just executing production tasks, he was solving technical problems. He was keeping the machines running. He was contributing to something larger than himself. Klaus had become increasingly isolated. His attempts to maintain ideological unity had become almost pathetic in the face of overwhelming evidence and the simple human preference for the comfort and kindness that America had offered. Some of the most committed ideologues remained in his orbit, but even they seemed to be going through the motions rather than genuinely believing. The world had changed. Belief in Germany victory was no longer tenable, and without that belief, the ideological structure that Klaus was trying to maintain simply collapsed. Otto could find sympathy for Klaus, even as he recognized that Klaus was making a choice to remain in denial. Klaus was suffering from the dissonance between his ideological commitments and the reality he could no longer deny. Klaus was choosing not to grow, not to adapt, not to accept the new reality. And in making that choice, Klaus had become progressively more isolated and more bitter. But Otto could not save Klaus. Each person had to come to their own understanding. Klaus would have to make his own journey. Otto could only live his own life, as honestly as he could. In January of 1944, Otto received a visit that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Evelyn, one of the American workers at the factory, approached him during a lunch break. Evelyn was a woman in her early 30s, a widow. Her husband had been killed in the Pacific Theater 2 years earlier. She worked on the assembly line, performing with precision and skill the complex tasks required to ensure that the vehicles being produced met military specifications. Evelyn approached Otto, and she said, in careful words, that she wanted to give him something. She had knitted a pair of gloves, winter gloves. She said that she had noticed that
Otto's hands sometimes seemed cold, and she wanted him to have them. She said that she understood that he was far from home, that he was a prisoner, but that he was also a human being, deserving of warmth and comfort. He was overwhelmed by the gesture. He tried to refuse, understanding somehow that it was not appropriate for a prisoner to receive such a personal gift from an American worker. But Evelyn insisted. She placed the gloves in his hands, and then she walked away, leaving Otto standing with the gloves, tears beginning to form in his eyes. He wore those gloves for the remainder of the winter, and every time he put them on, he thought about Evelyn. He thought about a widow, a woman who had lost her husband to the war, taking time to knit gloves for an enemy prisoner. He thought about what that gesture meant, about the possibility of human compassion transcending the boundaries of nationality and enmity and war. Those gloves became a kind of spiritual talisman for Otto. They became evidence that another way was possible, that humans could choose compassion even when compassion was not required, even when it was not convenient, even when it was directed towards an enemy. In the spring of 1944, Otto learned that the war was still continuing, that the Allies had invaded France, that D-Day had come, and German military forces had been pushed back, that the territory of Germany itself was beginning to be threatened, that the end was coming but slowly, piece by piece, month by month. The knowledge that home, his home, was in danger created a new kind of anxiety. Otto thought about the Rhineland. He thought about the towns he had known as a child. He thought about his father. He wondered if the bombing that his father had written about had intensified. He wondered if his father was still alive. He wondered what would become of Germany when the Allies reached it. And he found himself hoping, with an intensity that surprised him, that it would be this America that reached Germany. That it would be people like Tom, like Jack Donnelly, like Samuel, like Evelyn, like the nurse who had bandaged his hand, who would be present when Germany was finally occupied. Because if it had to be occupied, if Germany had to be defeated and conquered, then Otto wanted it to be conquered by people who had shown him kindness, by people who seemed to understand that humans could disagree, could be enemies, but could still treat each other with respect and dignity. It was a strange hope. It was a hope built on the recognition of defeat, but it was also a hope built on the evidence of human goodness. And Otto found that he preferred a future that involved defeat and kindness than a future that involved victory built on lies.
The war ended in May of 1945. For Otto, it ended quietly with the arrival of news at the camp. The Germans had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. After merely 6 years of warfare, after the deaths of millions, after the complete devastation of Europe, it was finished. Otto was still a prisoner, but now he was a prisoner of a war that had ended. He was no longer the enemy soldier in a far-off land. He was a man whose nation had been defeated, whose nation would now be occupied, whose nation was being inventoried and assessed and prepared for a reckoning of its crimes and its failures. The transition from prisoner to something else was gradual. He continued to work, the factories continued to operate, but the character of his captivity changed. There was no longer the question of when the war would end. There was only the question of when he would be sent home, when he would be allowed to see his father again, when he would be allowed to return to a Germany that he could barely imagine, devastated, occupied, facing an uncertain future. In the months that followed the war's end, Otto reflected on what he had learned, what had changed within him, who he had become as a result of spending years in America, witnessing American industry, encountering American kindness.
He realized that he could no longer believe in the narratives that he had been given to him. He could no longer believe that any single nation or ideology held all truth. He had seen, directly and irrefutably, that human capacity for cruelty and kindness transcended national boundaries, that industrial organization and human decency were possible even in a capitalist system, that Americans were not the weak, divided people he had been told they were, and that Germans were not the superior people he had been told they were. The realization that the propaganda had been inverted in almost every way was both liberating and devastating. Liberating because it meant he could begin to think for himself, to observe reality as it actually was rather than as he had been told it was. Devastating because it meant confronting the fact that he and millions of others had believed lies, that they had sacrificed and suffered and killed in service to lies. But Otto found that he could also feel gratitude for the Americans who had treated him with fairness and kindness, gratitude for Tom, for Jack Donnelly, for Samuel, for the nurse, for Dennis, for Evelyn, for Robert, for James, and for all the other Americans who had shown him that another way of being human was possible. He thought about what would have happened if the war had gone the other way, if Germany had won. He thought about the concentration camps, some of which he was beginning to learn about through the fragmentary information reaching the camps. He thought about what a victorious Nazi regime would have done, about the expansion of horror, about the total subjugation of Europe under Nazi ideology. And he realized that defeat, his defeat, Germany's defeat, had been a mercy, not just for Europe, but for Germany itself, because Germany under Nazi rule had become something that could not be saved.
Destroyed and rebuilt. And being destroyed and rebuilt by Americans, by people who had shown him kindness despite being his enemy, seemed to Otto like the only possible redemption. He thought about his father. He wondered what his father was experiencing in the Rhineland. He wondered if his father was alive. He wondered what his father had learned during the war. He wondered if his father's journey toward doubt had continued. He wondered if they would be able to talk when they were reunited about how they had been lied to, about how they could rebuild their understanding of themselves and their nation on a foundation of truth rather than propaganda. In September of 1945, Otto was repatriated. He was sent back to Germany. The journey home was long and complex, but eventually he found himself in the Rhineland, in the town where he had grown up, in a landscape that had been damaged by bombing but was not destroyed, and he found his father. His father was still alive. He had survived the war. He was thin, worn down by years of fear and loss and uncertainty, but he was alive, and when he saw Otto, he wept. They embraced. And in that moment, Otto understood that both he and his father had survived more than just the war. They had both had to let go of certainties that had structured their entire lives, and they had both had the possibility of beginning again. They talked in the following days about what they had learned, about the lies they had believed, about the journey each of them had taken from certainty to doubt to a different kind of understanding. They talked about the future, about what Germany might become, about the possibility of rebuilding on a foundation of truth. Otto kept the gloves that Evelyn had knitted for him. They were worn, the yarn was beginning to fray, but he kept them. They were evidence. evidence that humans could choose kindness even in the context of enmity, evidence that compassion could transcend the boundaries of nation and war and ideology. In the decades that followed, Otto lived a quiet life. He worked in a precision tool factory, a work that allowed him to draw on the skills he had learned in America. He married. He had children. He told them the story of his time in America. He told them about the factories. He told them about the kindness. He told them about how a widow had knitted gloves for a prisoner of war. He told them about how encountering the truth had been more difficult than believing the propaganda, but also more liberating. And through Otto's telling, and through the telling of thousands of other German prisoners who had similar experiences, a narrative began to emerge in post-war Germany. A narrative that America was not the enemy that needed to be defeated. A narrative that American society, despite its flaws and contradictions, had something to teach. A narrative that cooperation with America might be possible. That rebuilding under Americans' guidance might not just be tolerable, but potentially beneficial. This narrative did not erase the pain of defeat. It did not make the Holocaust less monstrous or the war less tragic, but it did create space for reconciliation. It did create space for Germany to rebuild not in isolation and in bitterness, but in connection with the Western world. It created space for the Marshall Plan to be accepted and to work. It created space for NATO to exist and to include Germany. It created space for the Cold War to be fought without Germany turning entirely towards Soviet influence. The German prisoners of war, who had been shocked by American industry, who had been transformed by American kindness, became some of the first ambassadors of a different way of thinking about the West. They carried back to Germany the evidence that American democracy, despite its flaws, was not decadent, that American workers were not oppressed, that Americans themselves were human beings capable of fairness and compassion. And in this way, Otto's experience, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of prisoners, became a small but significant part of how post-war Europe was rebuilt, how Germany rejoined the international community, how the foundations were laid for the peaceful integration of Europe that followed. The factories that Otto had witnessed during his captivity continued to function after the war. Some were converted back to civilian production. Some were repurposed for the emerging Cold War effort. But they remained evidence of what was possible when human ingenuity, industrial capacity, and organized labor were dedicated to productive purpose. And Otto remained as well. An aging man in the Rhineland, wearing gloves that a widow had knitted during the war, remembering the moment when his entire understanding of the world had been shattered and rebuilt, remembering the shock of discovering that propaganda was not truth, remembering the kindness of enemies, remembering the possibility of redemption through honesty and work, and the choice to treat even prisoners of war with basic human dignity. The story of German prisoners of war shocked by American industry is not a simple story. It is not a story of good triumphing over evil. It is a story of complex humans confronting the collapse of false certainties. It is a story of how industrial capacity is not just a military asset, but a statement about what is possible.
It is a story of kindness, demonstrated consistently and without expectation of return, can transform consciousness. It is a story of how the truth, however difficult it is to face, offers more hope than the most compelling lie.